In this video, I'm going to show you how to sell anything to anybody in 2025 using what I believe is really the best sales script in the world, especially for online service-based businesses. But this will really work for any type of thing that you're selling. You can take this and apply it to multiple different verticals. And this is really based on my experience running a $30 million a year sales training recruiting company, as well as having 3,000 plus clients and seeing what we implemented with them. So if you want the script, just DM me script on IG. That's the easiest way for us to send it to you. We can automate it that way. So at Cole Thomas Gordon, just DM me script. To give you a little bit of context, if you don't know me, my name is Cole Gordon. I own Close.io. We're a $30 million a year sales training recruiting company, mainly in the high ticket space. So we're kind of known as the category king in that space. So therefore, I'm sort of known as this expert sales trainer or guru, whatever you want to say. But it wasn't always that way. In 2016, 2017, I was the worst salesperson on the team by far. And in order to get better, I was reviewing all of the top guys that were on my team. I was reviewing their sales calls and looking at the end and really trying to figure out what were they doing that I wasn't doing. And what I thought I would find was essentially a bunch of judo, objection handling, and like crazy, all this stuff. But instead, what I found was they weren't getting any objections at all. And in fact, most of their closes really objectionless closes, where the prospect was essentially closing themselves. And this is really the biggest realization I made in my sales career, that the best way to handle objections is to actually prevent them and then never have to handle them in the first place. So over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, I've taken 3,000 to 4,000 sales calls, and I created a framework that really allowed me to have a ton of success. And what I discovered was there's 7 beliefs your prospects need to have to buy. We'll cover what those are in a second. And that also means that there's 7 limiting beliefs or 7 objections or types of objections that keep them from buying. So what we want to do in the sales process is break down the limiting beliefs and then reinstall the empowering beliefs that we want before we transition to the close. And in doing so, we can create an objectionless close where instead of having to hard close the prospect essentially closes themselves. Okay. And so any sort of sales script that I've seen, whether it's from Jordan Belfort or Grant Cardone or any of the other sales trainers or gurus out there, what I found is they all kind of fit within the 7 beliefs framework. Now, they might have different styles or different ways to do it, and I certainly have my own style, but if you notice, they'll all actually cover these 7 things. So as long as you have those 7 things, really any sales script that you can use is going to work. I'm going to teach you the framework that I use that I think is the most effective way to be able to do this, and that's what this video is going to be about. So what we're going to cover is essentially the 7 beliefs, how to build them, and then the entire sales process. So with that being said, what are the 7 beliefs? Well, there's pain, doubt, cost, desire, money, support, and trust. Okay? So to walk through these really quickly, there are 2 types of pain. Pain is really the gap, okay, between where they are now, where they want to be. I would call it the gap, but it doesn't sound as good. That's really what the first thing is. And so it's the gap, all right? Now, there's 2 types of gaps, so to speak. There's an actual pain or a problem, and then there's an unfulfilled desire, okay? So these are 2 different things. So let's say you're buying stem cells. If you're buying stem cells, you could be buying it for because you have knee pain, all right? Well, obviously, in that case, we have a real pain, and we're trying to go from below average back to average, okay? So that gap is more of a pain. If you're obese and you're trying to lose weight, right, you're going from below average, you just want to get to normal. You're not trying to get the 6-pack. You're just trying to get to normal. So that's below average to average. That's a pain-based gap. The second type is an unfulfilled desire. So take the same thing, stem cells. So essentially, if you're buying stem cells like me, I do it once a year, and I just do it for general longevity purposes. So if I'm doing it for general longevity purposes, I'm not trying to go from below average to average. I'm trying to go from average to excellence, from par to above average, okay? Let's say I bought a weight loss program. Well, I'm already in pretty good shape. So if I was trying to do it, it would be to get down to, let's say, 8 to 10% body fat and have like a 6-pack and all this stuff. That's not below average to average. That's average to excellence. Now, certain framing can all depend around this. Like you could have somebody who feels like they're below average and buying, let's say, a business training to get to average because their friend group is all like doing, let's say, $10 million a year. So there is some stuff that exists like that. But in most cases, it's very, very straightforward. So the first thing you need to do on a sales call, which we'll cover later, is establish really what the gap is. Okay, where they are now to where they want to be in. Is it a pain or unfulfilled desire? Because the rest of the conversation is built around all of that. That's it, right? The entire conversation is about the problem. That's because when we solve a problem, we create value. And business is all about you solve a problem, you create value, and people exchange money for that value. So if we know that to be true, sales is really just a demonstration that we can solve a problem for somebody else. But we have to cover this first because if there's no problem, there's no sale. Okay? So the second thing is doubt. which means there has to be an inability to fix the problem. So in other words, like, why can't they just do it themselves, right? Or would doing it themselves take unnecessary time, resources, energy, attention, reputation, etc., to be able to do it? And they'd rather just have a proven pathway to be able to get there quicker. They'd rather be able to have a proven path so they can limit the mistakes and the costs associated with those mistakes and so on and so forth. But really, why can't they do them themselves? Now, with certain products, let's say Hyros is a SaaS product a lot of people in my audience use. Well, obviously the doubt is built in because you're not going to build your own ad tracking software, in the next 90 days. Okay. So it's just easier to just buy the product. So sometimes doubt is built in. Other times it is not. Like if you sell coaching, for sure it is not. You need to establish it, right? The next thing is cost, which is essentially why is leaving the problem or the gap unchanged more costly in the long term in the form of time, energy, money, reputation, etc. It could be multiple different types of things emotionally than just the cost of investing into the program, not just money-wise, but again, the time they put into it, the energy, the reputation. So it's very, very well known in the sales world. You need the cost of inaction to be substantially higher than the cost of action, okay? And it has to be substantially higher, so much so that it crosses really what's called like an action threshold, okay? So when you can get that much, much higher, you get the urgency, and what that really eliminates is the I want to think about it or I want to wait till next quarter about it objection. So the most classic example of this is if you've ever been to a Tony Robbins seminar, he has people do the Dickens protocol or something along those lines, where essentially like you sit there and you basically fast forward your life 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in the future, not having achieved the things that you want to achieve, not having showed up the way you wanted to show up, and it builds all of that internal pressure, all of that internal cost of inaction, of not doing what the things you should be doing, and then it brings that forward to the present moment. So in a great sales call, we're obviously not going to have them visualize the Dickens thing, but there's ways to do that actually bring that to the present to help them actually take action. We'll cover that later in this training. The next thing is desire, which is the compelling payoff to fix the problem. All right, so they have the gap. What's going to be the compelling payoff if they actually fix it? So the reason this is important is there was a study done by Cialdini. This was actually way before COVID, actually, but it was about a vaccine, and there's 2 vaccine advertisements. One was just about all the problems of not having a vaccine, and then one was about the problems and the benefits of having the vaccine. So it was like there was a pain and gain message, and then what was called a pain only message. And the pain and gain substantially outperformed the pain only message in terms of getting people to take action on the advertisement. And so the reason people theorize that is because when you get a prospect only associated with the pain, it does make them want to take action, but if they have nothing to direct it towards, they just get paralyzed and they don't do anything. So you have to be able to motivate them with the pain to be able to take action, but direct that energy somewhere. Otherwise, you get paralysis by analysis. The next thing is money, which means do they have the resources and willingness to fix the problem? Okay, you can see how everything is predicated around the problem. Resources and willingness to fix the problem, which is really 2 different things. So resources means do they physically have the resources? So essentially, if they don't have any money whatsoever, right? They have $500 to their name, they're couch surfing somewhere, and they have 0 on credit, 0 on everything else, and they don't even have a car. Well, like, I don't care. If your product's $10,000, you're not going to be able to sell it to them, period. Okay? That's resources. Willingness means they might have the money, they're just not willing. So I'll give you an example. I used to coach a dating coach back in sales, way back in the day when I did one-on-one sales coaching. And he got to the end of the call with a lawyer making $250,000 a year, and the lawyer had a bad dating life or what have you. And the lawyer certainly had the money, but when the dude dropped $5K as the price point to invest into the program, he kind of scoffed at it and wasn't really willing. He had the resources, he just wasn't willing to make that investment. Now, willingness is really not a financial objection. It's actually a smoke screen for what we just covered, which is cost. Okay? Then you have support. Okay? That means do people around them, close to them, or other stakeholders in the decision, whether that's above, equal to, or below, support them in fixing the problem. So this is where you have spouse and partner. But in a business context, this could be above. So this could be a board. This could be you're talking to the sales director or an executive, and they need to get approval from the owner or the CFO. It could be you have a business partner, but one's not on the call. It could also be, like, I'll give you an example. For me, sometimes I might be on a sales call, but there was a certain time where I actually wanted to check with my team to see if we had the bandwidth to be able to implement what was being said on the call before I actually invested in that program. And turns out when I actually went to the team, we didn't have the bandwidth, so we delayed it 2 months. But maybe if the salesperson would have done a better job and actually flushed this out, he could have overcame that before I went and talked to them. Real quick, and then we'll get back to the video. If you need help with any of these 3 things, either installing a lead acquisition internally in your business, you need new sales reps and you want sales reps recruited done for you and also get the sales consulting and sales management help that comes with that, or if you just want overall business strategies of how you can scale to 8 figures or beyond, go to the link in the description, click that link, check out the video, and then book a call with our team. We'd love to help you with any of those 3 things. Now back to the video. The last thing is trust. And what I'll really say here is this is, of course, trust in you and trust in the brand and the company and the social proof within the company. But most importantly, it's trust in the methodology. So what I like to say is when you're explaining your pitch or your offer, it should really be the simultaneous explanation of why everything they tried in the past has failed and why this is going to be different. Okay, so by the nature of explaining your offer or what you're doing, you should be able to explain to them the costs of not having it. And also, essentially, if they tried similar ways to fix this problem in the past, why those didn't work and how this is going to be different. So they should be educated on why it didn't work. So I don't really believe in, let's say, the ketogenic diet outside of certain medical conditions, but it's a great example. Let's say you're like a ketogenic diet coach or whatever, and your offer is around the ketogenic diet. Well, let's say somebody's been doing flexible dieting. They've been just kind of trying to cut calories, like basic stuff, and it hasn't been working for whatever reason, right? You might, through explaining the ketogenic diet, explain why, hey, the real reason why stuff hasn't worked in the past is because, you've been eating carbs and your insulin is higher, et cetera. And because of that, you're not in fat loss mode, you're in glucose mode. And once we eliminate that and we actually get you in a state of ketosis, the fat loss is going to come much more naturally and you're not going to be as hungry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So by the nature, and I'm not a ketogenic diet expert, but by the nature of explaining what my offer is and my protocol with the ketogenic diet and my health program or whatever, I'm actually explaining to that person why what they tried in the past hasn't worked and why this is going to be different. Okay, now I don't particularly believe in the ketogenic diet, but another example, let's say for this is, let's say you sell some sort of agency service where you're implementing a funnel. Okay. And, if you sell that type of service, you'll know that many of your prospects have tried different agencies in the past. So what's really clear and what's really important to do on the sales call is define, okay, you worked with an agency in the past. What was the actual methodology they were using? And let's say that previous agency was using something that's a little bit outdated, like a 90-minute webinar funnel to book calls. You would explain how the market has shifted over time, over the last several years. Those types of long-form approaches don't work anymore. So what you do is more of a short-form approach that still builds authority and pre-nurtures, pre-educates, and pre-frames prospects before speaking with you, but it does it in a short-form, very quick, frictionless way. And that works a lot better than the webinar. So by the nature of you explaining that, they also learn why the thing didn't happen in the past. So hopefully that makes sense. So how do you actually build the beliefs? Again, most scripts will do this naturally when you learn from it. Here's how I like to do it. Now, in previous versions of this training, I've given you guys problems for syntax. So in the 2024 and 2023 version on the channel, I've given you what's called problems for syntax. There's also, and what I'm going to explain in this video, is goals for syntax. So it doesn't really matter, essentially, if you start with the problem or you start with the goal. Typically, what I like to do is if you're going after an existing pain, like if somebody's coming on and they want knee pain, you start with problems for syntax. Or if somebody's coming on and you're selling stem cells and they have knee pain, it's a problems for syntax because it's a pain-led conversation. But if somebody's coming on and it's an unfulfilled desire, let's say it's stem cells, but they want it for longevity, you start with the desire and then work backwards. Okay, so in this one, we're going to go over what it looks like to do a goals for syntax. This is also much better if you're doing stuff like selling a business opportunity, like you're teaching people Amazon FBA or getting them started with drop shipping or getting them started with whatever your kind of new opportunity is. This is a really good thing for that as well. Okay, when they don't have necessarily a big existing problem, it's more of getting after an unfulfilled desire. So here's how that's going to look. Here's the actual scripting and the call flow. So we're going to go through this step by step, but we have the introduction. Then we go into discovery. You'll see we isolate the challenge. Then we go to desired situation, then current situation. Then from there, we have a transition. We go into our pitch, committing phase, and then our close. So this will make a lot more sense as I go through it. And I might refer back to this so I can show you where we're at all times. First, let's start with the introduction. So we have Rapport, all right? So Rapport is very simple. This is like a 60-minute sales call, okay? This isn't like an outbound call or anything like that. This is like a 60-minute sales appointment. So let's say, this is over the telephone. We're going to like, hey, is this John? Hey, John, just Cole here. What's up? John's like, oh, nothing much. Excited for the appointment, whatever. Yeah, awesome. Actually, I was just finishing up my workout, finishing up my last call. So I'm super excited to talk to you. Have you been having a good week so far? He says, oh, I've been having a good week. Yeah, it's been busy, whatever. Oh, is it a good busy or is it a bad busy? Oh, it's been this has been going on, whatever. after that little exchange there, I just get right into it. I say, great. Well, I know we have a limited amount of time here. So you ready to jump in? You got a clean sheet of paper, something to take notes with? And then essentially we move on to the call. Okay. So the rapport, what we don't want to do here is talk about, the Baltimore Orioles or whatever. And like, talk about like their hometown. Oh, what the hometown like? It's like you don't want to drag it on further than just a nice, cordial 1 or 2, 3 back or forth, and then get right into it. You just want to act like a normal person. You don't want to be almost like trying to get rapport is kind of strange, right? Like there's not a lot of stuff that's going to happen in rapport here that's going to help the sale. If anything, the extra fluff here hurts more than it helps. All right. Then we get into frame the call. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. I like teaching people the standard frame the call just because I feel like it helps closers really feel like they have control over the call. And at the same time, in any business context, it's very, very standard in any business call to just state what's the agenda from the call at the very, very beginning. Okay. Like I remember talking to somebody who worked at Goldman Sachs, and one of the things that they mentioned is like every call started with a stated agenda. So some people think this is salesy. It's only salesy if you sound like a scripted robot. Okay. If you sound natural and like you're really talking to the person, not reading like a telecompliance script, it's going to be fine. All right. So I'll say something like this. Hey, so what I really found to work best on these calls is really to dive in on the specifics of your business and your sales process. And ultimately like what's working right now, what's not working right now, and what you feel like are the challenges that are keeping you from moving forward. And, once we get some clarity there, I can tell you a little bit about what we have going on over here. And if that makes sense to you, we feel like it's a fit, we can definitely move forward and talk more about that. Or, I'm a pretty well-connected guy in the space. So if not, I can connect you with somebody else if that makes more sense as well. Is that cool? Okay, perfect. And then I always end it off with saying, so that being said, probably our best place to start is what would you say right now is, let's say, the biggest challenge in your business, or like what's not working at the level it truly could be that it should. All right. So right here, you could see the way I said it, it didn't sound like a telecompliance script. I was like talking to the person. It was relatively customized. So the key here is to drill this 100 times, but then once you get on the call, just say this 80%, 90% right, and let it come out naturally in the moment. Okay. So that when you try to read it word for word and you're like looking at the script and the prospects over here on Zoom, it's going to sound like a telecompliance script and you're going to sound stupid. You want it to sound authentic. Okay. Another different way I do this sometimes is I'll just start off with a question of like, hey, so I know you responded to this ad, and this ad was about X, Y, and Z, and you put in your application X, Y, and Z. So I got a little bit of information there and I have a good idea, but I want to really hear from you. What was like the main thing you saw from the ad that really prompted you to reach out? Then they say, oh, blah, 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 this, that, and the other. Okay, great. Totally understand that and totally get that like the main thing you want to get into on this call is learning what we do and essentially how we generate appointments and so on and so forth. Everything we do is all customized. So what I really found worked best on these calls is let me just get an idea of where you're at and kind of what you're needing and also how your business works. And then I can tell you if we can fit in, and if so, how we can fit in. And if it makes sense and that makes sense to you, we can get into the specifics of what an engagement would look like. Is that cool? So that's like a very custom way to do it where I can prompt them with a question, take what they said, and then imbue it into a frame the call that's totally customized to them. So that's another way you could do it as well. Now, this question here, I always start with, what would you say right now is the biggest challenge, or what's not working at level truly could be that it should? Now, the key thing that you do with this question is you have to ask it with the right tonality. So you don't ask it like I just said it. It has to be like, gotcha. So, probably our best place to start is, what would you say right now is like the biggest challenge in the business, or like what's not working at the level it truly could be that it should? So you see how I vary the tonality there? Sometimes when you say, yeah, man, so the best place to start, what's the biggest challenge in the business? Sometimes you'll get responses like, well, there's no challenge, but some, X, Y, Z. So when you say it like this, and then you throw in that little softener at the end, what's not working at the level it truly could be that it should, you almost never get anybody pushing back to this question. Okay. Now, in a business context, sometimes you need background information before you can actually ask educated questions. So like if you're selling like health coaching, if you're selling dating, if you're selling a lot of things, you can skip this. But sometimes if you're selling a software and that kind of, there's a lot of things depending on, if you're selling an ad attribution software like Hyros, well, you might direct the conversation a little bit differently if they're an e-commerce business, a software business, or a coaching business, right? So it would make sense to just clarify the basics of the business before you get into it. Like with what we sell, We sell sales recruiting services, but that can look entirely different if somebody's at 50K a month or 10 million a year, right? So we'll do a few questions just to get context, like, okay, what do you sell, right? At what price point? How does what you sell work? Like, how is it actually delivered at a very high level, 30, 60-second overview? And okay, like, how do you get clients? Like, what's the A to Z process of somebody has no idea who you are to becoming a paying client, And then also, what's the ideal customer? So, and what's your level of revenue right now? Those are like kind of the main ones we'll have to ask, because otherwise we can ask uninformed discovery questions, right? Like, you're going to ask different questions if somebody's doing 50K a month versus $1 million a month, obviously, right? It's going to inform how you're going to direct the conversation. So again, we're going to start off with isolating the challenge. All right. I know this I said earlier, this is a desired goals first syntax, but I still want to know why they're here. Okay. So once I kind of understand what the problem is, then essentially what I'll do is I'll move on to the desired situation. I'll kind of pin the problem and circle back to that later. Okay. So now we get into the desired situation. So it's very simple. All right. So the first question I'll ask once I've kind of pinned the problem, okay, great. Makes sense on that. We'll circle back to that in a second. The next thing I want to go to is, okay, I think the easiest way to kind of navigate this conversation is to begin with the end in mind. So for you, ultimately, what's the goal? Okay. That's the question I always use to kick off the desired situation section. Now, why do I use that question? It's very broad, and people will criticize it because it's broad. Well, that's the whole reason I use it. Okay. So, I've asked this question in the past, and you will get a wide range of responses. Some people will tell you money. Some people will tell you they want to build a nonprofit in Africa. Some people, they'll tell you it's retiring their wife. It's just interesting to hear what they say. So I like to leave it broad, but the three things I'm looking for in this section is, and we'll dive into these separately, is the monetary goal. I may financially qualify them. We'll go through that here. I want to know what their long-term vision is for what they're doing. And I also want to know what their non-monetary goals. In other words, like, how would achieving this affect another area of their life, which I'm not going to ask it that way. I think that's a very salesy way to ask it. I ask it in a very finesse way. Okay. So I'll ask ultimately, what's the goal? Now I might have some probing questions. Tell me more. Why is that important? Whatever. Now, the next things I'm going to go into is if I'm only going to ask these questions that I've highlighted on the screen right here, if they don't give me that already. If they give that to me already, I can just skip it. I don't have to ask it again, obviously. But some people with scripting, they're just so literal, they'll just ask the same damn question again. So the main things I want to know is, okay, the monetary goal. So I'll be like, hey, and what's the monetary goal? What's the target that we're looking toward? Where do we want to grow the business? What's the goal? Whatever. And then usually they have a goal, like they've thought of it before. And I'll say something like, okay, great. Well, as soon as they say that, let's say they want to grow to 100 grand a month. So I'm like, hey, so what's the monetary goal? Where do you want to get the business to? They're gonna be like 100 grand a month. What I want to say is, instead of saying, okay, well, why would that number be important to you, which is very salesy. Instead, what I'm going to say is, oh, well, it seems like you thought of that before. I'm curious, like, why that number? So what I'm doing there is I'm achieving the, hey, well, why is that goal important to you question? I'm achieving that outcome without asking it in a salesy way. Because what I'm doing is I'm basically pointing out that it seems like they've settled on that goal and that it's premeditated and they thought about it. And I'm asking them to justify that behavior to me. So you're going to see I use this all the time, but it really plays off the consistency bias in Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, where people want to appear consistent. So when I can get them to qualify that goal to me, I get a much better and deeper and honest response without it seeming very salesy. It just seems like I'm curious. Okay. Now, if you're selling, let's say, something that's like weight loss or whatever, you just need to, the easiest way to do these types of sales is there needs to be some number assigned to current situation and desired situation. So essentially, if you're selling like weight loss, I would want to know, hey, what's the dream weight or whatever, right? If you're selling dating or something, it maybe is how many dates do you want to be on a week, or, you need to assign some sort of number to it. Okay. Now, in a business context, this doesn't necessarily work with non-ROI offers, but let's say it's an ROI-based offer, like they want to start a new business in AI agency or something like that. The question that's very easy to ask to qualify them financially is, gotcha. And so that, let's say they tell you their goal is 50K a month, right? But they're working full time. Okay, great. Well, and how much money would you have to make just to replace the amount of income that you're making full time? Okay. And ultimately, is that the goal, to transition out of that? Would that amount of money be enough to actually replace the amount, or is that just enough that allow you to leave? Okay, what will be the number that actually replaces that amount? Okay, and then you clarify. So once they give you the number, you have to clarify and say, let's say they say 5K a month. Okay, so you're making 5K a month right now. Is that correct? Now, these are some questions I'll cover in a second, but what I'm doing here is instead of being like, well, how much money do you make a month? Which some people will just tell you, right? But instead of asking that, what I'm saying essentially is I'm financially qualifying them, but I'm framing the question as a goal. So again, that eliminates sales resistance. So I'm like, okay, you want to make 100 grand a month in your business. That's your ultimate goal. How much money do you have to make just to replace the amount of income that you can make full time? And let's say they say 10. Now, sometimes they'll say a higher number than what they're actually making. So if they say 10, I'll be like, gotcha. So you're making 10 grand a month right now in your company, or sorry, in your job. And so that gets them to correct the record if I'm wrong, right? Because sometimes they'll say 5. But for whatever reason, they want to make 10. That makes them feel like that's enough to replace. Now, once I get the actual number, let's say they're only making 5. So I'm like, so you're making 5 grand a month right now? And they're like, yeah. Then sometimes I'll throw this in there. Sometimes I won't. But you're like, oh, okay, great. And you're married, you have a family. Okay, cool. Hey, can I ask you an honest question? I mean, you're doing 5 grand a month right now. You live in San Francisco. Obviously, that's an expensive cost of living area. You have a family, and you have kids. I mean, is that amount of income putting you in a tough position financially? Yeah. In what way, though? So that's a good way to essentially kind of pry into the financial situation. It drives up some pain, but also gives you kind of an insight into the financial qualification of the person. I'm not one of these people that goes super, once you're on a sales call and you're on a 60-minute call, I'm not one of these people who like really tries to hit and qualify financially really hard. You're on the call anyways. You might as well make an offer. Now in a setter conversation, maybe that's a little bit different. If you're booking an inbound call and they're filling out an application, maybe that's a little bit different. Once you're on the call though, there's pretty much nothing else there's nothing else better than you could be doing than making an offer. So you might as well just get the person sold, see if you can get them in some way, shape, or form. Now, once we have that out of the way, this is a very simple question I'll ask. And what's your long-term vision for X? Hey, what's the long-term vision for the new agency you want to build? Just very open-ended. Sometimes you'll get some really good stuff there. So I want to ask that. Now, sometimes they'll answer this question when you ask ultimately what's the goal. If they do that, you don't have to ask the question. All right. Then I'll leave off this section with a really good question. And so again, the purpose of this question is to identify how would achieving that goal affect another area of their life. Now, that's a very common sales question. Okay. So the issue with that question is it just sounds very salesy, and especially in a business context, people know what you're doing. So here's how I say it. I say, okay, well, and can I ask you a personal question? And the reason why I'm asking this is because when we work with clients, our goal is not just to help you build a business building you wealth, but also one that's allowing you to live whatever lifestyle that you want to live. So when you think about that, what does that look like to you? Like, what are the non-monetary goals? What are the personal goals that your business would allow you to achieve? Okay. So when you ask it like this, you get a way better response. Trust me, I've taken thousands of calls. I know it from experience. Why does this get a better response? Okay. Well, a couple of things. This framework's called permission, reason why, question. Okay. So I say, now, can I ask you a personal question? That's permission. Permission increases compliance, which compliance means they give you a better response. So permission increases compliance. And when I say, can I ask you a personal question, it presupposes a personal response. So there's presupposition and permission here that both can increase compliance. Okay. So I ask permission. Then I say, and the reason why I'm asking you this is because, and then I basically state the reason why I'm asking the question and their own best benefit. Okay. Which also is like moral authority. It increases compliance, right? And why is compliance so important? Well, I want them to give me better answers. Because it's not about the questions I ask, it's about the answers that I get. Because that's what's going to hold them accountable at the end of the call, right? And then I basically say this whole spiel right here. The reason why I'm asking this is I want to help you just build a business building your wealth, but also one that's allowing you to live a lifestyle that you want to live. So when you think about that and better command, what does it look like to you? What comes up? What's the non-monetary goals, the personal goals that your business wants you that you want your business to allow you to achieve, right? Then I finally ask the question. So this will give you way better responses than just, well, John, how would achieving that create, success in other areas of your life? How would that impact your relationship? People would be like, what? It's so salesy. Anybody with any degree of sales experience is going to know exactly what you're doing. So this is a very easy way to start the call because we're talking about the fun stuff. We're talking about goals, super easy. So now we're going to get into the current situation. Okay. Now in this section, all right, I'm going to kind of frame this. You'd have to tailor it a little bit for other offers, so to speak. But I'm going to tailor this as if you're selling like a business opportunity, like you're helping somebody start. I'm going to go with the AI because it's trendy right now. Let's say you're helping somebody start an AI-based enabled agency. Okay. So um, what we want to do when we get to current situation is ask, okay, and what do you do for work full time right now? They say whatever they do. Okay, cool. Do you like it? And that presents them with two options. Either they don't like it and then they start like complaining about it, and you can be like, okay, well, cool. Like, well, what's the worst part about that? Well, take me back to take me back to the day where you said, enough is enough. Like, what happened? Right. So you can start to pry into that type of stuff. And then eventually, once you pry a little bit, you'd say, okay, great. And how long you've been doing that job for? And how long you've been thinking about starting this business? Oh, I've been doing that job for 10 years. I've been thinking about starting this for the last 6 months. Okay, great. And can I ask you a personal question? After all of that time, I mean, you've been thinking about this for like 6 months. You've been doing that for 10 years. Um, what's kind of like the moment that's become like the final straw for you? Like, what's really made you kind of draw the line in the sand and say, this has got to become a priority now, though? Like, what shifted for you? What happened? So you'll see how I do this here. But again, what I'm doing here is, okay, do you like it? They don't like it in this case. You pry a little bit. How long I've been doing so? So I start to paint the context. I stretch it out. Oh, I've been doing this job for 10 years. I've been thinking about this for 6 months. And then what I do here is a very similar framework. It's just called permission context question. So here, can I ask you a personal question? Same logic as what we already covered. And then I paint the context. So I'm like, hey, you've been doing that job for 10 years. And, you've been thinking about doing this for 6 months now, but you're finally on the call with me right now, actually looking into doing it. So like, after all that time and, being here right now with me today, what sort of shifted for you? Like, what's happened that's made this a priority now, though? Okay. So what I do is I basically kind of stretch it out and I sort of point out the inconsistencies in their behavior. And then I ask them to justify that to me. This is the alternative of saying, the very rookie way to say it, well, okay, why is doing this important to you now, though? Or what's going to happen if nothing changes? Those questions, people know why you're asking them nowadays. So this is a way you can kind of embed that same outcome into a much more personable framework that's based on the context of the conversation, and therefore you get a much better response. So hopefully this makes sense, okay? And what's really key about this is you see how I throw in the language, what shifted for you? What happened to make this a priority now, though? Okay, what happened? Right? Because I learned this actually, I thought of it from Tony Robbins one time. He always talks about when we want to make a big change in our life, there is always a moment of decision, okay, where kind of like something happens and it's like enough is enough. We draw the line in the sand, we step across it, right? It might have been when you stepped on the scale, you wanted to lose weight and you stepped on the scale and you finally saw yourself break 200 pounds. I remember there was one where I heard that, somebody's child hopped on their lap and they said, "Mommy, you feel squishy." Right. I remember reviewing a call one time where somebody said, my wife works full time and we make a great living because I make this and she makes this. But, a shooter went into the school 2 months ago. And at that point, I was like, I need to at least give her the option to not be trapped in that school working in an unsafe environment if she doesn't want to. And that's an extreme example, but like, that's the stuff you might get when you ask a question like this. Right. So now let's say you ask the same question. What do you do for full time? Do you like it? They do like it. Okay. Oh, what do you like about it? Okay, great. And the same shit. How long have you been doing it for? 10 years. How long do you think about starting this? 6 months. Okay, wow. Well, can I ask you a personal question? I mean, you've been doing this for 10 years now and you like what you're doing. So I'm curious. You've been thinking about this for 6 months. You're on the call with me to actually look into seriously doing it. After all that time and even liking what you're doing, how come this has become a priority now, though? Like, what shifted for you? What happened? I do the same exact thing. I just kind of paint the context. And I kind of point out the irregularity in the behavior, especially with this one, because they like their job, but they want to leave it. And then I ask them to qualify that situation to me. You see how hopefully this is better than, well, why is this important now? Now, if they give you a bullshittery response to something like this, you can use what I call the any other reason question, which is essentially there's two reasons people do anything. There's the reason it sounds good, and then there's a real reason that they tell you if they had a couple of beers. Like my classic example of this is I remember teaching somebody this framework, and it was like a very similar offer as we're teaching here. The guy wanted to start a business, and he kind of gave a fluff response to this question. And the salesperson was like, "Gotcha. I mean, I guess that makes sense, but is there any other reason you want to do this now, though?" And the guy was like, "Yeah, My wife never believed in me, and I want to prove that wrong. So it's like, it's kind of just like a funny, like, I remember that because it was just so distinct. But, there's the reason this sounds good that they might post on social media or something like that. But then there's like the emotional real reason. And that any other reason why question typically will get that if you don't get it the first time. Okay. So it just goes, I guess that makes sense. Is there any reason this is a company for you now, though? Something like that. Okay. So then we ask the Dow question, which is basically, okay, what's been the biggest thing that's kept you from getting this started yourself? Like, what's in the way? All right. So again, like, why aren't they going to do it themselves? You just want to elicit that out and make sure that's there. Then we ask some solution questions. And in a lot of contexts with goals for syntax type offers, you're not going to get a whole lot of this. But, have you reached out to anybody in the help to get help with this in the past? Are you working with anybody right now? Have you been out there considering other coaches to possibly work with for this? Have you done coaching before? So you can ask these questions. They're generally not that important unless somebody has done what you've been trying to, like somebody has essentially done where you're kind of offering in the past, and now you need to differentiate. And now you need to kind of get to the thing we were talking about earlier, where your pitch, you need to get the information correctly in this point about what they tried in the past, because you need to make your pitch the simultaneous explanation of why that didn't work and why this is going to be different. So, and a lot of times, like with coaching or starting a business or whatever, it doesn't come up that often, but it comes up tons of times with like done for you services, tons, right? So you really got to look into, okay, great. Well, what happened there? Like what went well, what didn't go well? What was your expectation versus what actually happened? Okay, totally understand. A lot of times when people come to us, like we're left in a place where we have to pick up the pieces of somebody overpromise and underdeliver. And what we found working with thousands of clients who've been in those situations is typically when they work with somebody in the past and it didn't work out, it's one of three things. It's either A, B, or C. So which one of those things do you think it was? And you can kind of box them into something that you can cover later on in your pitch. To where later on in your pitch, you can just say, hey, how earlier when you worked at that agency and they had you try X, Y, and Z methodology, hey, that was really good 5 years ago, but things have shifted. Here's what's shifted, and here's why that doesn't work anymore. So instead, what we do is X, Y, and Z, which works a lot better now for whatever reason. So hopefully that makes sense. Solution questions is like a whole thing. I have deeper trainings on that. If you guys are interested, you can look into one of our programs. But it's very, very key that if they've tried something similar to what you're offering, you can make sure you really educate them on how this is going to be different. Then, of course, we finally get into support-based questions. So, do you have a business partner? Are you married? And in this example, I have more of a spousal type questionings. So like, hey, are you married? Well, obviously you're making a big transition in your life. You're working in this job for 10 years. You're looking to do something entirely different now. Like, is she supportive of you launching your own company? Like, what does she think about this? Does she know you're on this call? What do you think should be newer on this call? Right? So certain questions like that we like to ask. It's a lot better to have this section right after they tell you why this transition is so important, why they have to make the leap and why they're making this leap, etc. Because then you can just kind of throw in, are you married? Is she supportive of this big jump that you want to make? What does she think about? You can get into all of that. Obviously, if it's a business context, the question I like to ask is, hey, what is your, and I actually asked this one way above here. If it's a business call, I ask it like very early on when it says background questions if needed. What I'll say is, what does your leadership structure look like? Because really what I'm asking is there any other decision makers? But when I say, what does your leadership structure look like? They don't know I'm qualifying them in that way. But essentially, I'll be like, what does your leadership structure look like? You have a business partner? Are you the sole owner? How does it work? And they'll be like, oh, I'm the sole owner. Okay, great. So then I know that the decision maker, I can move on. But I kind of get through it without triggering any sales resistance of like, oh yeah, this guy's like qualifying me. Okay. So now that basically hits everything. We hit pain, doubt, cost, desire, money, support, trust. All right. If you're wondering how and where, right? I'll just go through the script, but obviously the desire, that's hit here. The pain, that's hit here. The cost is hit in this. Can I ask you a personal question? Permission, context, question. The cost is hit there. Desire, we hit. Doubt, we've hit here. So pain, doubt, cost, desire, money, we hit up here in this financial qualifier. Okay. Support, we hit here. All right. And then trust, we kind of started to hit here. Trust is the only one that you do have to ask some questions about, but then really the make or break is in your transition and your pitch. So hopefully that makes sense. So with that being said, how do you transition? You got all the information that you need. What's the way you kind of transition nicely into the pitch? Well, the first thing I say is, gotcha. Well, look, I don't feel like I have any more questions. Is there anything else you feel like we haven't covered that you feel like I need to know? They're like, a lot of times they're like, no, I feel like you understand exactly where I'm at, right? That's what we want here. A lot of times, like in old school sales, there's like, you try to impress them with some sort of recap. Well, John, like, let me see if I got your situation right. You said you came out and like, you just like recap all your notes to them. And it's just like corny. This achieves the same outcome without the corniness. And sometimes like you'll get some good information here. You'll be like, is there anything else we feel like we haven't covered that you feel like I need to know? And they'll be like, they'll tell you something that's like a bomb. And you're like, I'm glad I know that, because otherwise you would have gotten to the end of the call and obviously you couldn't have pre-handled it. So if they say, oh no, I feel like you have a good understanding of my situation, here's what we say here. Well, John, based on what you told me so far, we can definitely help. So for instance, and then what you want to get into is I just put thoughts, okay? This is optional. You could just get into this next sentence here, which I'll cover in a second. But the thoughts, quote unquote, can be like a case study, a personal story, some basic valuable insight on the what, not the how. So like a lot of times, like let's say we're selling our B2B training. What I'll really try to do is kind of frame them up so they're ready for the pitch. I call that the pre-pitch. So, I'll be like, hey, we can definitely help. If you don't know us, like here's kind of what we do. Essentially, we've worked with these types of brands in the industry. We've worked with people like Tony Robbins, Dean Graziosi, Ryan Serhant, Jay Abraham, some of the biggest names in the industry. Those are 10% of our clients. 90% of our clients are people just like you who are looking to go from blank to blank to blank in whatever time frame. And one of the big things that we see for clients like you, and really in your situation that I'd be focused on, is X, Y, and Z, right? So like I, a lot of times kind of will break down any limiting beliefs that they have in the transition and kind of chip away at those so they accept my pitch better, and I'll reframe them wherever is needed. I'll also outline kind of the big things that they need to shift along the way to be able to get there. Okay. But, maybe it's, I could be like, we can definitely help. For instance, we had a client just like you, like so-and-so, who went from this to this, they said this, you could share a case study. Similar, you could share your personal story, so on and so forth. But at the end, I'll end off with something like, that said, or I'll be like, does that all make sense? We'll be like, yes. Okay, cool. Well, that said, where do you want to go from here? I can basically walk you through what an engagement would look like, pretty much A to Z if you would like, but where do you want to go from here? Okay. Or, but where do you want to go? And essentially I call that, question, suggestion, question. It's like a, question sandwich. And essentially what I do is I basically say, where do you want to go from here? I basically suggest exactly what I want them to do. And I say, but you tell me where you want to go. Now, every single time they're like, yeah, walk me through it. So they basically they basically ask me to pitch them. Hopefully that makes sense. The big thing here is where I see people mess this up is they'll do it like this. They'll be like, so, where do you think we should go from here? I can walk you through the process like A to Z if you want, but where do you want to go? You just tell me where you want to go. I'm like, well, yeah, like a lot of times, and then like, just tell me the price, tell me then they'd start to like take the control of the call because you just like threw it up there and look like you have no idea what you're doing. It's not like a complete pansy. So you got to like moderate your tone with this. So it should sound like, gotcha, so that said, where do you want to go from here? I can basically walk you through what an engagement working like with our company would look like, pretty much A to Z if you would like, but you tell me where you want to go. Okay. Now, no matter what they say, even if they tell me to get to the price, I'll be like, yeah, let's get down to the nuts and bolts. Let's get down to exactly how this works. And then I just go into the pitch. So like, no matter what they say, I just do the same thing, but this is kind of it's just a fluid way to do it. All right. So now we get into the pitch. So the pitch is comprised of a couple of parts. There's the high level promise. There's the bridge, which is the pillars and the steps. And then there's the delivery. So the high level promise is just kind of like, hey, this is what this is all about. Okay. So I'll say, hey, you still have that pen and pad? So on your paper, I'll write out 1 through 4. All right. With a little bit of space in between. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, write it out. And then you wait till they've actually done it. Okay. And then I'll say, hey, let me preface this by saying what this is not. What this is not is it going to be us getting a bunch of modules telling you good luck. It's not going to be you getting on some group coaching calls and there's 150 people on the call and you got to wait 3 hours to get your questions answered. And basically at the end of the day, it might as well have been a freaking, course. Okay. What this is a one-on-one program where we actually implement this stuff inside of your business with you and really drag you across the finish line to make sure that you can go from X, Y, and Z revenue to A, B, and C revenue in this time frame. Right. I just kind of made that up on the fly. Right. But like I usually do, hey, here's what this is not, cover some common objections, just nail them out of the way. What this is, and then I kind of regurgitate back exactly what they already told me on the call. What this is a 4-step process to help you go from blank to blank to blank. A 4-step process to help you go from really having no lead generation whatsoever in your real estate business to be able to have a mechanism that generates high-end listings, which is what you want, so that ultimately you can list the last and be able to generate a portfolio of more listings that'll also bring in buyers for the long term as well and grow your business to $100,000 a month in commissions. Whatever. Okay. So, and then I'll say something along the lines of like, and for specifically for you, it's going to be 4 things. Okay. The first one is, and then I go into pillar 1. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you the framework of how I do the pillars. And then after that, I'm going to give you an example. Okay. So the pillars, this is like a formula. I recommend using the formula, but not trying to pitch using the formula. Use the formula to kind of flush out what it should be. But then like you have to reword this stuff in a way that makes sense naturally with the way you talk. Otherwise, you're going to sound like a monkey. Okay. But the formula is really important to kind of like flush out what you want to say. All right. But if you try to say it like this, you're going to sound dumb. All right. So the best way to pitch your deliverables, okay, is essentially, hey, when it comes to achieving, I'll put it this way. When it comes to really scaling a successful AI agency out there, here's the problem. Most people, when they're just getting started, they try to do insert incorrect behavior. And because of that, they end up having X, Y, and Z problem down the road and ultimately end up with X, Y, Z consequence. So instead, what we do is X, Y, Z feature that you do, which allows you to benefit and then ultimately benefited that benefit. Does that make sense? And they'll be like, yeah. What are your thoughts on that? And that double tie-down is very important. Because if you say, does that make sense? They're always going to say yes, even if it didn't make sense. Sometimes I'm like, why do we even ask that? But it's a nice breakup to the conversation. But you kind of have to double down. What are your thoughts on that? Or, hey, does that make sense? Cool. So I know we were talking earlier about X, Y, and Z, and you mentioned this. Do you feel like that would actually help you based on what you experienced in the past? What you want to do with these pillars is create dialogue. Okay. And one thing that's very key about the pillars are not necessarily the features. Like a pillar is not one-on-one coaching. Okay. A pillar is like, if you map out current situation and desired situation, it's the milestones of what we're going to get done. All right. So like if you're starting an AI agency, I'm going to like totally fudge this up. Right. But like if you're starting a AI agency, pillar 1 might be product market fit. Right. Pillar 2 might be scalable fulfillment. Pillar 3 might be scalable acquisition. And pillar 4 might be like systematized sales process and something like that. Like, because like when you're starting a new business, like you got to, do market research, figure out product market fit. Then you got to create a compelling offer. Then you got to create some leads. Then you got to sell the leads. So you see how that's like a linear, like bam, 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 bam. That's kind of how it needs to sound, right? So they can visualize themselves getting the result as you're explaining it. So you're more explaining the high level. You're not explaining like, we're going to meet with you this amount of times yet. You're going to do that later. Okay. Now the key points of this framework, okay, is you can see how when I say most people out there, when they're trying to get this outcome, have this problem, that's like an us versus them frame. And it's also kind of a new versus old frame. So if I'm like, hey, most people out there, when they're working with agencies, most agencies are having their clients run 90-minute webinars. That could be good if it was like 2017. But nowadays, attention spans are like the size of a peanut. Like, that's why TikTok's huge. Okay, so a lot of times these people run these webinars, they get super low-cost leads because broke people are the only people who stay for 90 minutes in the first place. And all the people who have money, who don't have time, just ditch out in the first 90 seconds of the ad. So what we do, and then see how that works, that's kind of a new versus old frame. Now, what we're also doing here is problem linking. Okay, most people do this incorrect behavior, which leads to the problem, which leads to the consequence. So instead, what we do, and then I benefit link, is do this instead, which leads to benefit and ultimately benefit. So it's like a chunking down, chunking up type of deal. Okay. What we're also doing is, what I've already mentioned previously, is that simultaneous explanation. So by the nature of them explaining what we're trying to do and trying to get done, I'm explaining what they maybe have done in the past, or if they haven't done anything in the past, I'll just explain what people commonly do and the mistakes people commonly make and why that doesn't work. Okay. So what's really key here is when I do these pillars, I never just say, so we're going to do this. What I always do is I start off with the problem, or I start off with essentially explaining what happens if you don't have this thing. So for instance, when I explain our B2B sales recruiting, one of the things we do differently is we give people reps. But at the same time, what we do is we added consulting and sales systems implementation so that they don't just get the rep, but the rep has a great home that they can have success in. Okay, so the way I'll explain this is I'll be like, look, so the first thing we're going to do with you is build out a great sales system. All right, so there's two parts to a winning sales team. There's the people and the vehicle. People is obviously 50% of the equation, and we run a talent business, so we know that's very important. But the problem is most people and most business owners, they just focus on the people. That's all they do. Okay, and if you put a great person into a bad system, the bad system wins every time. If you put a great driver in a Honda Civic, he's not going to win the Daytona 500. So because of that, what we want to make sure you do if you're a client with us is you have a great sales system. Okay, because when you have that, what happens is not only is your churn going to go down because the sales rep's more likely to succeed, they're going to ramp faster, which saves you a ton of money. And on top of that, good salespeople look for good sales systems. So it actually gives you a better offer in the recruiting marketplace. So that's why the very first thing we're going to do is build out your sales system. Okay, so here's how that works. So you see how, like I said, all of that stuff before I even got into the sales system. And then when I explain the sales system, it's actually pretty simple. But like I teed up the importance of it so much that they're like, by the time I get to it, they're like super bought in. And they also understand the cost of not having it, why most people out there when they're trying to build sales teams fail. That's what we're trying to do here. Now, did you see how I loosely followed this framework? I did not say this framework word for word. That's very key. This framework is great for flushing it out, but like you got to workshop it in a way that you talk. Otherwise, you're going to sound like, you'll know. You'll be like, man, I followed Cole's advice, but I got on this call. Man, I sounded dumb. Well, yeah, because you need to talk normal, but you just need to hit these little elements. All right. Now, the other thing that I do here is a double tie down. So again, we want to create dialogue around the offer. What we don't want to do is go on a 15-minute monologue and be like, all right, what did you think? They're going to check out. So you need to kind of pause and create dialogue throughout the entire thing so that they can digest it. Okay. So, that's why I say, does that make sense? Cool. What are your thoughts on that? All right. The only other thing I want to say here about the pillars before I move on is the only thing more powerful than doing it the way I said is by relating it directly back to their situation. So that would sound a little bit different. It would sound like this. It would say, hey, earlier on the call, you told me you did this and ultimately ended up in this. Well, the problem with that is X, Y, and Z problems. And a lot of people do that out there and it leads to X, Y, and Z consequences. That's why instead what we do is whatever, right? So if I can relate it back to their situation, if I can say, hey, how you told me earlier, use that agency that told you to do lead forms. Well, here's what we've seen with lead forms. I can tell you, as soon as you told me that, I knew 100% you were going to get results. I wasn't surprised at all. Because the problem with lead forms is, and then you would say whatever the problem with lead forms is. Okay. So try to start off with, how you told me earlier you did blank. But the reason we script it out like this way is sometimes you have to pitch these pillars and they haven't said anything that really relates to it. So it's better to have the initial scripting as like a catch-all, but if you can incorporate their language and their experiences to tee it up, it's 10 times better. Okay. So let's go on to an example. This is like what I used to use way back in the day. So this kind of still would work now, but it doesn't work nearly as well. So I would say, hey, so the first thing we're going to do with you is build out your productized offer. Okay, your productized offer. So here's the thing. When it comes to dialing in your paid traffic, here's the problem. Most coaches out there, they're totally focused on ads, media buying, what's the best funnel, what's the best ad strategy. If you look at what they buy and read and the low ticket products, that's where their focus is. But the reality is a bad offer with the world-class media buying is still going to lose. A great offer with a monkey media buying is actually still going to win. So in reality, what it's really all about is your offer. Okay, so what a lot of these people do is they don't realize that. They spend a ton of money on ads, and targeting, bidding strategies, and all this complex stuff, and ultimately just realize eventually nothing is going to work because their house is built on a foundation of sand. So, for example, how earlier you said the competitor X, Y, and Z is crushing it on ads and you're barely breaking even? Well, you guys have the same exact business. Why is that? It's because of their offer. Okay. It's the same reason we were able to generate $1 million plus off 150K ad spend last month. It's because of our offer. So what we do instead is help take you through an offer intensive to help you build out an offer that's positioned as unique, different, superior than other competitors in the marketplace, because that'll not only help you differentiate so that your ads work, but because you're differentiated and you're much more specific, you can charge a premium, right? We'd rather be the brain surgeon than the doctor. And then when you can do that, that actually makes your ads work even better because you cash flow and ROI the ads even better. So on top of being differentiated and getting that traction, you get a better ROI because of the better economics. So does that make sense? Okay, well, what are your thoughts on that? So I kind of just riffed that, but like, just so you know, like back in the day, 2017, it's still actually prevalent now for the most part, but like a lot of people were super Facebook's obsessed, media buying obsessed. And then essentially, really their issue is like, they're charging by the hour, right? Like, so like a therapist and they're like, yeah, I want to run Facebook ads to my offer. And it's like, well, what do you charge? $100 an hour. Okay, it's not going to work. So this was like the big reframe that typically we needed to happen. So here's the deal. What you're going to do is you're to continue that process for the next 4 pillars. 3 or 4 is good. I usually don't have 2, usually don't have more than 4. Now, generally, the way you want to structure these pillars is the first 2 pillars kind of are your big results that you're going to get them, and the big kind of like epiphanies and reframes. So when you hear me say stuff like, it needs to be the simultaneous explanation of why everything tried in the past has failed and why this is going to be different, that really happens in pillar 1 and pillar 2. Pillar 3 and pillar 4 is really just like, I don't go, those are usually very simple explanations because we're going to be implementing stuff after that already assumes we got the result that they were looking for. So I'll give you an example is like, if I'm selling lead generation to gyms, it might be, I don't really know exactly the best practices there, but it might be the first pillar is the offer. The second pillar is paid acquisition. The third pillar is like creating a scalable sales system. Well, obviously that third pillar, by the nature of getting there, it assumes we've already gotten the results. So I don't need to do a bunch of like crazy reframing there because like that's not what they're on the call for. But I am future pacing them through that, which is quite nice. So they're thinking, it also eliminates the fear of success because some people are like, okay, well, even if I get these leads, I don't even know how to handle these leads. Okay, boom, taken care of, right? So we want to do that. That's very, very key. The other thing is, I don't have this here, but after the pillars, then I walk them through pretty quickly on, okay, and in terms of how this is all delivered, deliverable. Okay, so I make 90% of the pitch about the result and the path and the journey and why what we do is different. Then like you get this amount of one-on-one calls, we meet with you this time, you get access for this amount of time frame, that's all like just bam, 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 right after I'm done with pillar 4. Then we move on to the committing phase. So I'll say, okay, cool. So that's basically the process. Okay, we covered, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. What I'm really curious for you is like, how do you feel? Like, do you feel like we talked about getting, your business to X, Y, and Z revenue per month? Do you feel like this is what you need to be able to get there? Now, what we're looking for is a certain answer and a certain tonality. Okay. And I don't mean, when I mean certain, I mean like certain, not like, hopefully you understand the play on the words there. What I'm looking for is like competence. All right. So if they're like, dude, absolutely, that's good. We could just move on. If they're like, I think so. I'm just going to call it out. I'm like, I think so. Like, oh, just tell me what's really going on. Okay. So what we want to do here is obviously temp check. That's why it's called a temp check, to see where they're at. If I sense any tonality, if I sense any uncertainty, whether that's in their tonality or they just explicitly say it, then we're going to dig into that and we see where we're going to be off. Now, if they start to bring up price, I'll be like, hey, no, we're going to cover investment in a second. But I'm just curious in terms of the process and the steps, like investment and everything aside, do you feel like it's what you need to get to whatever? Okay. And then, you have some like, if this is a good little bit you can use if they're uncertain and you can't really figure out why, you can just say, hey, I hear you, totally makes sense. What's really important to us is alignment. Like we're investing a lot of resources into you the same way you're investing resources into us. We want to make sure you're bought in before we start working together. So I'm curious, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being like, I hate this guy, I want to get off the phone. 10 being like, okay, that's exactly what I need. Where do you feel like you fall out exactly? Okay. And, if they're at a 9 or a 10, I move on. If they're at an 8, I'm like, okay, great. Just being honest, what do you think is keeping you from specifically being a 10? Okay. So this is stuff you can kind of do in the objections as well. But I like to do it sometimes pre-price drop. Now, once we got that done, what we're going to do is move on to this transition language. Now, what's really key that I did forget in this script is before this, there needs to be a section for questions. Okay. So after we do the deliverables and the pillars, what we'll do is we'll essentially be like, okay, great. So we covered 1, 2, 3, and 4. What questions do you have on, I have more to cover with you, but what questions do you have on what we covered so far specifically? Okay. Now they're going to ask a question. And what you're going to do is make sure you know what question they're asking, step one. So clarify the question. You're going to answer in 1-2 sentences or 30 seconds or less. And then you're going to say at the end, great question. What else? What are the questions? Okay. So if they're like, hey, is all this thing just group coaching? You're going to be like, okay, great. Well, there's community and group elements to what we do. But just to clarify, is like, there's a specific reason you're asking that question. Now, the reason why I want to say that is for this reason you're about to see. Then they say, let's say, oh, well, yeah, I hate group coaching. I want to avoid group coaching at all costs. I did this program in the past. It was group coaching. They said I was going to support. I didn't get support. So I just want to avoid that. Okay, great. Well, I'm really glad you brought that up. Like what we do is very one-on-one. You're going to have X amount of one-on-one calls over X amount of time frame. There is group elements to what we do, but like there's not 150 people on those calls. There's maybe 10 tops. So in the case where you do have to go to a support call, it's not going to be like you're there for 3 hours to get one question answered. So that shouldn't be an issue for you at all. Does that make sense? But great question. What else? What are the questions? So the reason we want to clarify the question is, number one, a lot of times I just see salespeople answering questions that weren't even asked. And when you clarify the question, a lot of times you can just answer it in like a yes or no or like a one sentence. So it just cleans up the conversation and just makes things simple. And then the other reason is a lot of times if you see the intention behind the question, they might ask, is this just group coaching? If you just said, oh yeah, we have group coaching, but then be like, oh, I hate group coaching. I don't want to do it. So like you want to make sure there's not an objection behind the question. Okay. Which is why you want to clarify the question. So you clarify the question, you answer it succinctly. Sometimes I just answer and I say, absolutely. And then once you're done, you don't want to just pause and then stare at them for the next question. You need to keep leadership of the call. The way you do that is you say, great question. What else? What are the questions? Great question. What else? What are the questions? Eventually they're going to say no questions. Then that's when you go into, cool. Well, how do you feel? Like we covered bam, 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 bam. In terms of the process specifically into what we covered so far, do you feel like it's what you need to be able to get to blank? Hard question, direct tonality. Not, well, you kind of feel like this might be it. Don't be doing it. It's like, you need to kind of like very directly ask because you want a direct response, a direct and honest response. Not, cool. You feel good? If you're going to do this, do it. All right. Now, once we get to the point where they pass the temp check and they have no questions, we literally just say, gotcha. So you feel really good. You have no questions. What's next? Where do you want to go from here? Very, very smooth. They'll really like that. And they'll usually ask for the investment. So if they're like, I don't know, you tell me, just be like, well, we can move on to the investment if you would like. Okay, perfect. And then usually what I go through is the onboarding. So I say, gotcha. So you process the investment with me. Once we take care of that, what we do is just set baseline. So what we're going to do is send you some homework right away. We're going to also look on our side of how we can get you the quickest wins, how we can look at your sales script, your pitch, or whatever, and then basically make sure your onboarding call is booked from X, Y, and Z date. Then on that call, we'll set your implementation pathway. That'll include when we're going to meet, how often we're going to meet, and you'll know your exact next 8-week plan or next 10-week plan or whatever from that point forward. Does that make sense? Cool. And the investment is just blank. So that's how you end the call from there. Now, if you want to know how to handle objections, I just did a video on basically like every objection possible. You can click that right here. If not, I'll see you in the next video.